Hey there, and welcome to part 2 of this deep dive into the Sonicware Liven Evoke. In this video, we are going to be exclusively looking at the Oscillator, or sound engine section, which is what produces the core sound of the synth. Everything else is about sound design, or sound effects, or sequencing sounds, or performing sounds. But those sounds all get started up here. Now, we already covered the basic parameters of this section in the previous video, so real quick recap. Every sound on the Evoke is a blend between an acoustic sound, like a piano, and an electronic wavetable, synthesis-based sound, like a sine wave. Or we also have white noise options. And then using this knob labeled blend as its primary parameter, we can blend those two sounds together however we want. At value 0, we have a 100% acoustic sound. All the way to the right, at 127, we have a 100% electronic sound. And we can go anywhere in between to blend them together to one degree or another. Now, one thing I want to note about this blend parameter is right now we're in a pretty middle range value, but that piano sound is much stronger than the sine wave. So if you really want to have more of a 50-50 blend, then somewhat counterintuitively, you need to bring the blend closer to the maximum value. However, this is going to depend on what kind of wavetable you are using. Right now, we're using a sine wave, which is a relatively weak sound. If we switch to something more based on a sawtooth wave, for example, well, now that's much stronger, and if I bring our blend back, now we can hear it much better. So do keep that in mind when you are mixing and matching different instrument and wavetable sounds and using the blend parameter. Okay, and then also remember that the way that we can switch which instrument sound we're using is with this knob here. And then the way we switch the wavetable is with this knob again, but it's a secondary parameter. So we put a shift hold on, and then we can select a different wavetable, or white noise. Okay, now I'm going to put the blend back on 100% the acoustic instrument sound for a second. And then remember, if we hold down a note, the Evoke starts applying backtide modulation to that sound, where we basically start going backwards and forwards with the sound. Okay, so that was all just review. Now let's get on to some new stuff. And before we dive into it, I'm going to do something here that's going to make our lives a lot easier, and that I think is going to make your life a lot easier with the synth as well. And that is, I'm going to turn on a function called latch. The way I do that is I hold down the function button and then press this button here that says latch underneath it. The light goes on to indicate that latch is on, and then if I press the button again, the light goes off to indicate that the function is off. And by default, this is set to off, so I'm going to turn it back on, and then I'm going to reset this pattern so that it's back to the default settings. I've changed the name of it to Hey, but it's just an empty palette. The reason I turned latch on was this. If I come over to the knobs now and I start turning them, well, you can see the value doesn't change right away. It only changes when the position of the knob starts to correspond to the value that the parameter is set on. And now I can change it. The reason why this is really useful is because latch can also help us to figure out what are the default settings of the various parameters on the Evoke. And that's especially important for understanding this section, because this section does come with a number of default values already baked into it, at least by default. And we'll come back to how to change that later. And one place where we can really see that is with our next two knobs. The first one is labeled backtide, and this one is labeled speed at the top. Backtide controls the depth or amount of backtide modulation that we're applying to our acoustic sound. And if I turn this knob, well, you can see it doesn't change until I reach 127, and that is because right now the default value of this parameter is set to 127. The maximum value, the maximum amount or depth of backtide modulation that we can have. By the way, you can also know what the default values or the last saved values are by looking at the screen and looking for this dot. That dot is called the origin mark, and it's a marker for which value this was last saved at, or what is the default value if nothing has been saved yet. So we have a maximum amount of backtide modulation right now. And now listen to what happens if I bring that down a bit. So obviously it's less pronounced, which you would expect. But if you listen really closely, let's put it back on the maximum amount for a second. Notice how the big difference here is that with the value maximized, we get a sound that goes sort of like, or at least that's my best impression of it. And what's happening here is with the backtide value maximized, imagine this is our sound of our piano. We're getting through the attack phase of our sound, and then we start doing the backtide modulation, the initial movement of which is to go backwards. And with the backtide value maximized, we get all the way to the beginning of the sound, and then we go forward again, and then backwards and forwards, and so forth and so on. And the upshot of that is, because we're getting back to the attack phase of the sound and going backwards, we get this distinctive reverse sound. And as we bring this backtide value down, well, we're still going backwards. So imagine this is our sound. We're still going backwards, but we're not quite getting back to the beginning. We're not reaching that attack phase. Instead, we're stopping somewhere like here and then going forward and then backwards and then forward. So another way of thinking about this is that we are either narrowing or widening the amount of backtide modulation that we are doing. Okay, and then this next knob, well, this one's more obvious. It's controlling the speed of our modulation. Right now, this is set to 70 by default, so a mid value. If we bring that value up, well, things start to get kind of nutty. And if we bring it down, it gets noticeably slower. And so if you combine a slower speed with a lower amount of modulation, like this, you get a much more subtle effect. And another thing that I would recommend doing with this, and with any kind of modulation for that matter, is try going in opposite directions with the two controls. So for example, try increasing the speed, but decreasing the amount. Maybe not quite that much. Or vice versa. Increase the amount, but decrease the speed. Okay, I'm going to reset our pattern again. So now if I come over here, notice we're back to 70. If I come over here, we're back to 127. And so with these two values, we are defining how the modulation will be applied, or how it will take place, the speed and amount of modulation. But when does that modulation happen? Well, remember what we said earlier. We have our sound. We start with this initial attack phase of our sound. And then once we get past that and reach the end of it, then we start doing this backtide modulation. But if you think about it, we could go through that attack phase faster or slower. And that would mean we would initiate the backtide modulation sooner or later. And that is what our next setting is about. So to access this one, you need to hold down the track button of the track you're currently in, so 1 in this case, and then use the value knob to adjust this value. Now you can see it's set to -80 by default. I know that because I can see the origin mark, but we can bring this value down all the way to -100, or we can bring it all the way up to +100. And the higher this value is, the faster the attack phase takes place. So for example, now it takes place almost immediately. Whereas if I bring the value back down, and by the way, you can hold the shift button down and go in increments of 10 to do this more quickly. If I bring that value all the way down to -100, now we go through the attack phase slightly slower than we did originally. And some interesting and weird things can happen if you take this value and put it all the way up, like so, and bring your backtide and speed values down. starts to sound like a completely different instrument. And by the way, if you bring these values all the way down, either one of them, backtide modulation will no longer be applied to the sound at all. Turning either one of these values to 0 is effectively turning backtide modulation off. And so now all that we're doing by increasing this value over here to 100 is we're going through the attack phase really quickly. And then we're not going backwards and forwards. We're just kind of stopping at the tail end of the sound. Okay, now I'm going to reset this again, pressing pattern, then OK. All right, and then one final control that we have over the backtide modulation is the secondary parameter of this knob here, which says attack. It's a secondary parameter, so I'm going to put on a shift hold. So this parameter is set to 63 by default on this sound. That's the maximum value. And then if I bring the knob down, we get to 0. And then if we keep going, we go down to negative 63. Now, what the heck do these values mean? Well, when the values are positive, we go through the attack phase of the sound with an upward loading curve. And then if we have a negative value, we have the opposite. We go through a curve that starts off slowly and then gradually speeds up. If you just play around with these values and compare and contrast, you can hear the difference. So this is our default plus 63. And then this is the opposite, negative 63. So it makes a big difference with how the onset of the sound sounds, how we go through that attack phase. And then this attack curve parameter and this attack speed or rate parameter that we control with the track button, they're interactive with each other. If I take this value and I bring it up, let's say plus 60, we sound like that with our default attack curve value, whereas we sound like this with the opposite value. And then both of these parameters are interactive with our other two parameters here as well. If we bring our amount of modulation down, well, now listen to that onset. If we bring up our speed, we have a very different sounding piano. So when you're experimenting with the backtide modulation, keep in mind that you have 4 coordinates here: attack rate, attack curve, which control how we get through that attack phase, and then backtide modulation amount, and speed, which determine how the modulation is applied once we get past that attack phase. And to be honest with you, so far in most of the music I've made with the Evoke, I've mostly focused on messing around with these two parameters here. I think there's a lot to explore with the attack rate and attack curve, but I haven't done as much with them yet. So I'm putting this out just so you don't feel like obligated to mess around with these two parameters at the start. Like, I would focus on these two first, and then once you're feeling more confident with the synth, then maybe start messing around with these two. Okay, I'm going to reset our pattern once again, so we're back to the default sound. And now let's switch over to the electronic side of our blend, our sine wave. Now, if we hold this note down, you can hear some subtle modulation going on, and by default that modulation is actually not coming from this section at all. It's coming from this section over here, our LFOs. By default, LFO1 is set to modulate our wave sound. Specifically, it's actually modulating the harmonic parameter of our wave sound, which is the secondary parameter of this knob here. But I need to explain what this is before I can really explain what we're modulating in the first place. So in order to be able to demonstrate this properly, I'm going to come to our LFO and I'm going to turn the depth all the way to 0 on it. And what I'm doing in effect is just turning this LFO off so that it's no longer modulating our wave sound. Now that I've turned our LFO off, in effect, if I play a key, we no longer hear any modulation. Okay, so now we can talk about this secondary parameter, our harmonic parameter. So shift hold on, and we can see that by default, this is set to 0. Now, if I hold down a key and I bring that value up, can see that we get up to 126, and then we get to something that says sync. I'll come back to that in a moment, but let's just focus on the numbers first. So we stop at 126 and go back down to 0. Okay, what these numbers are about is that what we're hearing right now is a wavetable, or part of a wavetable, I should say, because what a wavetable is, essentially, is a series, or table, of waveforms that have been arranged sequentially. Remember, sound is a wave, and if a wave has a different shape, it's going to sound different. And what we have inside of a wavetable like this, in this case, is 126 slightly different versions of a sine wave. We have this one, 0, for example. This one, 53, this one, 93, and this one, 124. So very subtle differences, and because they're so subtle, if we take our knob and slowly turn it, well, it doesn't sound like we have discrete, separate waveforms. Instead, it sounds like we're taking the same waveform and kind of morphing from one to another, even though in reality we just have these kind of static waves, but the differences sort of blur together. And if we take our knob and we wiggle it back and forth, well, now we're doing the same thing that our LFO was doing before. We are modulating the sound. And so that's what you're hearing by default. However, if you have the LFO off, then you can choose a static position within the wavetable and you'll just stay there. Or you can move this knob all the way to the right and get to sync. And now if I press a key, well, you can hear some modulation again, and that's because when this parameter is set to sync, we have modulation being applied to our wavetable, but it's not coming from the LFO, it's coming from our backtide modulation. Or essentially, we have a synchronized modulation being applied to our wavetable. And so now if I turn off our shift hold with sync set as the value for this parameter, and I go back and I change our parameters here, for example, our speed, well, you can hear that we have a whole lot of modulation going on now. And you can also hear that that modulation is being delayed to coincide with the attack phase of our acoustic instrument. And then it's only getting applied once that attack phase is over. And so if I come back over to our attack rate control, holding down the track button and bringing this value up, well, now that attack phase is so short that we almost instantaneously start modulating our wave sound, since it's synchronized with our backtide modulation. And just like with our backtide modulation, we can make this more or less subtle by adjusting our rate and depth controls. Okay, I'm going to reset once more, back to our default sound. And I'm going to turn our blend all the way to the right again. So we're back to our sine wave, and the final parameter I want to show you here is our pitch parameter, and this one is very straightforward. It's a secondary parameter, so put on a shift hold, and this is set to 0 by default, but if I bring it up, or down, well, the pitch goes up or down. And where this becomes useful is if you bring your blend back, so you can hear both sounds at once. Now, if I raise my pitch parameter, the pitch of our piano is unaffected and only the pitch of our sine wave goes up. And so now we've kind of bifurcated the pitch. And in this case, since I've gone 7 semitones up, the wave sound is a fifth above our original pitch. And so now if I play the keys, we sound like this. And you can also go up plus 12 to go a whole octave above the original sound with the wave portion of the sound. Or 19 to go 1 octave plus a fifth up. 24 to go 2 octaves up. Negative 50. Negative 120 to go an octave down. And so forth and so on. Okay, now setting this back to 0 for a moment, you can also control this parameter with the value knob. And right now I have my shift hold on, but if I turn that off and I use the value knob, now I can go up and down in increments of 1. And this can be really useful for detuning the wave sound from the instrument sound. goes a long way here. Okay, I'm gonna reset this again, and that does it for the parameters of the oscillator section. But there's one last really important thing to know about this section. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning with the default values. And to demonstrate this to you, I'm gonna come over here to our instrument knob. And remember, we've been in this grand piano sound the whole time. But check out what happens if I switch to a totally different sound, like, I don't know, an oboe. Okay, now I'm gonna come over to our blend knob and turn that, and check out what's going on. Our blend value is set to 0 now. And if I turn the knob, you also have those dots that are showing you what direction the default value lies in. Down here, it's 0. If I bring this up, now we have a very different sound. And if I go over to the wave parameter and turn that, we are in a different wavetable. We're no longer in that sine wave. And if I bring our blend value all the way back down to 0, so we're on our acoustic side, and now we go and look at our backtide modulation parameter values. Well, we can see that we have a speed of 70 and a depth of 111, which is different than what we had before. And if we go to our attack rate value, you can see that this is set at -50, which is a different value as well. And if I go to our attack curve value, well, that's different too. And if I go back to our acoustic instrument selection and I select a different instrument, like an organ, and now let's look at the wavetable, well, now we're back on a sine wave. Our backtide depth is back up to 127. Our attack rate is down here. And I think you're getting the point now. By default, every time that we change the instrument sound, all these other values change along with it. The synthesizer comes set with some default parameter values. And for example, with the wavetable, like this is the one that we have for the cello sound, well, the developers of the synth must have thought that, okay, this particular wavetable combines with the cello particularly well, so it's a good starting place. But it is just a starting place. You are definitely welcome to change this and make different sounds that way. Like, let's set it to, I don't know, this one, and then bring our blend up. Now we have a much edgier cello sound. And the more experienced and advanced you get with the synthesizer, the more you're going to want to be able to freely experiment with changing the default parameters and combining different sounds together. And that can be a little bit difficult to do when the synthesizer is set up this way, because let's say, for example, you want to see, okay, what does this wavetable sound like paired with other instrument sounds? Well, if I change the instrument, all the parameters get changed and we lose that sound, and so I'd have to go back and reset this and then change my blend value and so forth and so on. If you don't want this default behavior to happen, well, the solution is very simple. What you need to do is press function and then come down to this button here that says system underneath it. Press that once, you'll see the word instrument flash on the screen, and right now you can see that we are in what's called easy mode, where all these parameters have default configurations, and those configurations change every time you change the instrument sound. But you can turn it off by just turning the value knob until the screen says normal, and now we're in normal mode. And so now if I have my wave set to that wavetable from before and my blend parameter up, well, now I can freely audition what that wavetable would sound like combined with different instrument sounds, keeping everything else constant and not changing it every time I change the instrument parameter. So that's a very useful thing to know about. However, those default values are also pretty good starting places, so you might want to go back and forth between turning this off and on. I do that myself, and in fact, I'm going to go back to doing it now. I'm going to press function, system, I see instrument on the screen, I turn the knob to the left, it says easy, and now we're back in easy mode. All right, that'll do it for now. I'll see you in the next episode, where we will look at the sound design controls down here, focusing especially on the LFOs. And if you want early access to that episode and help to support the channel, go over to my Patreon at patreon.com/soniccartography, where you can get early access to this and future videos that I put out, as well as get some bonus goodies, including presets for the Evoke. Hope to see you there, and hope to see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.